Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to this podcast, I welcome you and I hope that this will not be your first and last episode of viewing or listening to us. We hope you come back for more. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So, before we get into the main event for today, just a reminder for those who are watching from YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications of new episodes of the podcast. And for those who are listening from Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure you subscribe there as well. And we're always welcoming any financial donations or contributions to help us build this platform and bring on more phenomenal educators like the one we're going to be interviewing today. You can send those donations through Cash App with the handle $IDTALK4ED, or you can donate through Venmo with the handle at Kwame SM. That's at symbol KWAMESM. And to catch future and past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And as always, thank you for the support. So today we have a special guest, and I know I say that every week, but today's guest is somebody who is different from a lot of the guests I've had in the show's history. We have a lot of teachers who I've interviewed who have started in the classroom and they've made their transitions to other career paths, whether it be in academia, whether it be other industries. But this may be the first time I'll be interviewing a former classroom teacher who went from that to now clinical therapy, which I think is interesting given the amount of teacher turnover that we've experienced pre and post pandemic. So I'm excited to be interviewing tonight's guest, who's a therapist. She's also a former classroom teacher, and she has used her educator experience to inform her clinical practice, which she does today. So I'm so excited to bring on Jess Cleeves to the podcast to talk to us about her educator journey and how it led her to do the work that she's doing today. So let's bring Jess on. Hello, Jess.
Hey, Kwame. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, how are things going?
Fantastic. I feel so lucky to be here. I'm such a fan and admirer of your podcast, and feels a little dreamy to be here chatting with you. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for supporting the podcast. When I first started this podcast, it was meant for educators like yourself and others to be inspired by other educators who are doing similar work and are aligned in terms of morals and principles when it comes to this wonderful profession that we love, even if it doesn't always love us back, which we'll talk a lot about in this conversation.
Well said. Yeah, well said.
So, Jess, as you already know, we always like to start from the beginning because we know that for many of us, teaching wasn't our birthright. It wasn't something that we grew up thinking, oh, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. We may have had other professional endeavors in mind, but for whatever reason, teaching fell into our lap. So I'm curious to know how that happened for you. Was there a person or an event that inspired you to become an educator?
It's such a cool question, and it's so fun to listen to how all of your guests answer this. And it's a hard question to answer because the path was pretty winding. When I think about my own time in school and my own teachers, I think I was equally inspired by the good ones and the less good ones. I'll get to that in a moment. I'll just lay the pathway out for you. When I finally finished undergrad, it took me a long time. I knew what I wanted to do. I bounced around between lots of community colleges because I discovered sort of late what I wanted to do. So the prereq adventure was bumpy, but I studied to become a conservation ecologist. I grew up with two parents who worked really, really hard, and with the good fortune of living out. We lived in the mountains. And so my closest relationships, odd as it sounds, were with plants and rocks. We're with the landscape. We're with, watching the seasons come and go. And I felt a real attachment to natural spaces and things. And I grew up in Colorado and it was super white, and I was informed by a very sort of normal 1970s white environmentalism that said that humans were separate from nature, that we were bad, and that nature needed to be apart and pristine in order to be protected. And I didn't have a lot of inputs to help me challenge that idea. So I thought being a conservation biologist was the way to contribute. I knew I wanted to contribute. And it took about a season of working as a biologist and, collecting more data to realize we have the data. We have the data. We are fully aware of the impact we're having on the planet. We are fully aware that the global majority and the poverty that we've caused globally, the people who are suffering most will continue to suffer the most for climate change. What we needed was political will. People needed to understand systems and how humans fit in. Thankfully, by then, I had completed my undergrad at San Francisco State, which has the most incredible ethnic studies program. They were actually one of the first ethnic studies programs that was sort of sanctioned by the university. Mm-hmm. And so thankfully, I was exposed to a lot of thinking that supported me to really shift how I was thinking about humans and our relationship with each other in the world. So started teaching and ended up liking it so much more than I thought I would. I ended up loving it. And through it, I ended up realizing that I really love working with people, and that it's not just ecological relationships that I find gorgeous and fascinating, but human relationships. And of course, supporting humans to have relationships with our non-human kin. So, it was accidental, and then it was tough to survive. And so just as my teacher identity was really hard fought, it was really hard to break. And it took several years of some pretty tough circumstances and consequences for me to come to the decision to leave. I do want to name a couple of teachers who were deeply inspiring. I want to name Jay Donaghy, who's a middle school science teacher, and Adair Williamson, who taught me how to write, which matters because part of the reason I'm here is because I wrote a book for teachers. So we can come back to why they matter probably later, because I learned so much from them in a way that I didn't even understand until putting this book together. Nothing about my external self tipped off my teachers that I was different. I was not the single student of color. I was not the single student with a visible or invisible disability. I was standard issue in the segregated schools where I grew up. And the unwelcomed parts were the parts that were kind of hep to the jive about some of the structural. So when I was in 9th grade, I stumbled into this class that was game-changing. It was a multicultural peer leadership class. And I think that was the first time I started thinking about systems. It wasn't the first time I noticed that our school was segregated. It was the first time that I started understanding that segregation might not be explained by the dominant culture reasons that I had been offered. My authentic self really loved learning. My authentic self really loved asking questions and figuring out the reasons behind things, the motivators, the structural components. And the part that was welcome at school was the people pleasing part. It was the part that was expected to get excellent grades, to keep quiet, to comply. And that's a real bummer for reasons that you've also explored gorgeously on the podcast. And it manifested in a really strange split personality kind of way. So, for example, I had a 9th grade geography class where the teacher would start talking and turn around and face the board. And I'm old enough that there were still chalkboards. So he was using chalk on his chalkboard, turn around after he took attendance. In my home, it was very clear that I would earn good grades. And so I had to stay for attendance because attendance was erroneously connected to my grade. And then as soon as he turned his back, I would split and head out the door and go to a coffee shop and read poetry or go for a walk. Our high school was pretty close to the mountains, so I would just go to the hills. And so there were these spaces where I was doing this real learning, this motivating learning, this learning that quickened my heart rate and inspired more questions. And then I was doing this sort of rote regurgitation and performance of learning. And I was so aware of the difference between those two. One of the, I've moved a few times in the last few years, and I found a notebook from high school. And I had invented my own Cornell notes where when I couldn't leave the class, on the right side of the page, I would take notes about what I was supposed to be taking notes about. And on the left side, I would take notes about the teaching. I would take notes about who was paying attention, who was being supported, who was being accidentally insulted, which I now understand is we call that a microaggression now. This division happened the whole time. And so I think my work as an educator in healing has been about integrating. How do I not shunt that part that wants to learn because learning solves problems and connects people? And how do I bring that to students? And now, how do I support teachers to insist on that kind of learning in their own classroom?
It's amazing how you were starting to take note of these nuances and tendencies. Because usually when we're in those beginning stages, we're not cognizant of all those things. It's usually later on in our careers where we start to see these instances, right? So for you to be able to catch that on that early, that's rare, as you already know. So as I was doing research for our conversation, okay, so you have this phenomenal teacher that starts off as a biology and ecology major in college, and then you start teaching science for a good number of years before making a transition, right? So before we talk about the transition out of the classroom, I want to get a sense of the shifts that were taking place from the time that you entered the
Mm.
classroom up until when you decided enough is enough. Because I think it's important for the audience to understand the ebbs and flows that come with this profession. Because as you know, we come into it with this romanticized view that we're going to save the world, as you've mentioned in your book, that we're going to do all these transformative things that's going to positively impact student learning. And then we get hit with the reality bug and we start to get discouraged and disempowered to make those changes. So I'd love to give you a chance to walk us through your own journey of how you got to this place.
Yeah. I mean, you summed it up essentially and nearly completely from my experience. What the combination of this, the helper tendencies that draw us to the profession and this sort of individualistic can-do spirit, what I found was when something wasn't working for me, I'd like to be really, really clear. I have the great good fortune of reporting that I was heartbroken to leave my students. It was not the students. It was increased centralized control of curriculum and a lack of support for just curriculum, for nonviolent curriculum. It was that my colleagues were so under-resourced and so wounded as well that there wasn't a lot of collaboration. There was a lot of competition. And so whenever I would sort of encounter a challenge, I would say, okay, well, how can I participate? I don't just want to complain about it. I want to actively make it better. And so all of a sudden I started collecting committees, and then maybe they're not listening to me on the committees because I'm not legitimate enough. So I'll go get board certified. Oh, still not changing it. Okay, maybe I'll start volunteering in the community more. So parents are going to get on my side more. Oh, maybe I need to start talking to board members. And, sadly, on making those decisions, no one granted me more hours in a day. No one granted me a greater total energy budget to make sure that myself and my loved ones were getting what we needed. And so I was burning myself out. And I was burning myself out through an exploitation that I allowed, that I permitted. And it was in the service of trying to heal what Doris Santoro called my demoralization. I was being asked to perform counter to the morals and values that had drawn me to the profession and in ways that harmed students. And so my answer to everything my whole life had always been work harder. And when working harder didn't work, when working harder just got me more resistance, I knew something had to change.
And thank you for even bringing this up, because that was going to be my next question. As I was looking through your book, which we're going to talk about, and for those who are listening, can you let people know what the name of your book is, Jess? Just let people know.
I sure can. I brought a copy because I'm so stinking proud of it. It's called Planning to Stay: Burnout, Demoralization, Exploitation, and How to Reclaim Self-Care, Your Classroom, and Your Life Anyway.
All right, thank you so much. And as I was looking through Planning to Stay, which is a great book, you all need to get a copy of it, especially if you're a teacher who has experienced similar challenges that Jess and even myself have experienced. My favorite chapter is actually chapter 2, where you actually talk about those three maladies: the burnout, demoralization, and exploitation. And as I was reading that chapter, so much of your story resonated with me. And I'm sure when teachers read it, they can point to at least one experience where they felt disempowered, where they felt unsupported by an administrator, where they were gaslighted by a parent, right? We've all had those experiences, especially when you're working in, whether it's a Title I school district or whatever. Like, you're going to experience that at some point if you teach long enough. What I found interesting was how you were telling the reader that burnout and demoralization tend to be interchanged when we talk about those terms, right? And I want to pull up a few quotes, because I always like to pull quotes up, because I think this is one that really is going to hit our listeners. So here in the very beginning, you talk about the fact that education depends upon exploiting the dispositions and commitments of service motivated practitioners. So that pretty much sums up a lot of what you're talking about, because when you think about the burnout, teachers get burned out because they're motivated by the service that we do as teachers. We're motivated to help our students. That's what draws us to the profession in the first place. But then it's exploitative because we think that there's some type of intrinsic incentive that comes with that, and extrinsic incentives when we think about, okay, we're going to get our loans forgiven, which doesn't quite happen for all of us. Oh, you teach for 5 years consecutively in a Title I school, and you put the work in and you get all your documentation, we'll forgive the rest of your loans. It doesn't happen that way. I still have friends who are in the profession still trying to get those loans forgiven. So I think in my case, I stepped away from the classroom because of not so much burnout, because burnout's temporary, right?
Exactly.
Burnout's something that you can recover from. But the demoralization for me is what got to me. And there's a lot of the things that you mentioned. The fact that I was working within a system that was subhuman, anti-human, right? That was oppressive. A system that did not center students. So these were things that I was feeling, but also witnessing. And it got to a tipping point to where I just said, all right, I got to step away. So I would love for you to really talk to us about how those three maladies, burnout, demoralization, exploitation, individually, but even at times collectively, can lead to teacher burnout and even just have a negative impact on quality of life.
Yeah, you nailed it. Burnout is the easiest to fix. It's also the most widely sort of misnomered. So, demoralization as a term comes from Doris Santoro's work. She's at Bowdoin. She's a philosophy professor, and she, with an education background, and she's really committed to high quality public ed. And she interviewed a bunch of teachers and was the one who made the relationship obvious between what in nursing we call moral injury, and in teaching she has coined demoralization. So burnout we can think of as an energy balance issue, and we can think of it on lots of different timescales. So we might be burned out from one period but recover the next. We might be burned out today but recover tomorrow, or by the week, or by the quarter, or by the school year. Burnout simply means I'm not getting refueled at the rate that I am pouring in. And so we can look at that in lots of different ways. We can look at it in terms of efficiency and routines. We can think of it in terms of managing our own sort of cognition. That's where a lot of the mindfulness-based stress reduction can come in, where we accidentally sort of leaking energy. The demoralization, is it okay if we go out of order? Is it okay if we save demoralization for last?
Not a problem. Let's do it.
Yeah, so the reason I want to name exploitation next, even though it's much less common in the literature and I think very rarely named, is because as you named, they are so tightly linked. Another thing I think is imperative to point out is that in addition to our helper natures, there's a much higher rate of folks who have experienced developmental trauma who are drawn to this work, right? So there are actually a bunch of wounded healers who are trying to heal systems through participating in the systems that continue to cause harm. And very often when we're in that sort of recreative space, we are accidentally perpetuating and participating in our own victimization. And because it feels familiar, we don't necessarily notice it. And we just keep asking in the currency that feels best. Sadly, frequently for educators, that currency is appreciation. And so when we aren't appreciated, we want to then work harder, let go of more of our boundaries, prove our worth even more. And we open the door wide open for our own exploitation in an already deeply exploitative system. Because we think that if I just do this one thing, they will see. Whoever the they is, because we're accountable to so many. Teachers are supposed to solve all of society's problems. So we're accountable to our federal government, our state government, our local government, and then our own sort of internalized cultural messages about what teaching is, what school is, who it's for, how it's supposed to work. So the pressures are immense and the support is low. The reason I want to name those two first is because those are both very behavioral fixes. To fix exploitation, I simply have to decide that I will no longer be exploited, that I will honor my contract. And I don't mean in a way that then can look like burnout. right? We always use the example of the person who leaves right at the bell as an example of a bad teacher, which is problematic. What we know we mean is there are people who are just phoning it in. That's the way they've decided to deal with not being exploited. They're just going to do minimal work. That's not really refueling, right? They are burnt out. And so what we want is to minimize our exploitation in a way that allows our teaching practice to be rejuvenating, pouring back in the energy. Then we can do the work of remoralizing our practice. We remoralize our practice when we say, this is why I'm here. These are the ways that I will interact with students and colleagues and the public. And this is what I will not do. And my deep hope is that, and frankly, Kwame, the book's been out for a while, but I waited to tell people about it because I needed to hear that it was actually helping teachers. And what I have heard is that teachers are standing up by grounding in the values that drew them to the profession. They are now participating in meetings and saying, no, I'm not going to give that benchmark assessment again. That's not what our students need. I'm going to create a new learning experience and it's not going to be on campus. We're going to go out into the world. Or no, I'm not going to run after school detention for you because it's a terrible idea. I will run a program where we're supporting students to build relationships and facilitating restorative justice circles, right? And so moving from that place of a remoralized practice gives a backbone to how we're going to set boundaries and how we're going to stop being exploited. When we can realize that it's not just about preserving us, but it's also about preserving ourselves in service of our students, it can help us shore up and find the courage to remoralize our practice.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. There's so many questions I have, and there's just
Ask them.
so many connections to what you're saying. I'm going to ask them. I'm sure will. Listen, so getting back to the exploitation, I feel like for as long as our public education system has been in existence, it's always been exploitative. It's always been that way. And I think when you look at our current social political climate, with all that's going on, whether we're talking about anti-CRT legislation, whether you're talking about anything that's anti-LGBTQ plus, ban books in different states, not just red states, y'all. Y'all think it's just the conservatives and right wingers who are running this. They're the primary people, but we got to look at some of our blue states as well. They're engaged in this same malpractice, but that's a whole nother conversation. So, what I'm hearing you say is with exploitation, essentially it's about standing on your principles and morals, staying aligned to who you are. And I think that's something that a lot of us don't do when we first enter this profession. A lot of it is about compliance, a lot of it is about staying within the status quo because that's what's safe and that's what guarantees survival. Um, and even when you were talking about just how our how things are structured, like currency, right? Think about it. In your average school district, in order for you to get your highest earning potential, there's a requirement for you to do some level of post grad courses, right? Whether you're pursuing a second master's, whether you're pursuing postdoctorate courses, or you're just getting a doctoral degree, you're paying money. You're going to have to take out a loan or grants if you don't have the blessing of a scholarship or some type of financial assistance, which in most cases you have to pay back down the road. These are things that have always been there, but yet we still come into this profession so naive. And then we find out after the fact that, oh, wow, this isn't what I thought it was. So, yeah, I just had to say that. I want to get into what led to you leaving, right? Because now you're
Mm-hmm.
not in the classroom anymore. You're not there.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing your clinical therapy practice, which I think is awesome. So tell me, what was your last straw for you that just said, all right, this is it. I got to get.
Yeah, I am grateful for the question because I think we don't talk about this a lot. And in preparing for speaking with you today, I really sat with how honest should I be about this? Um, because uh, we're not great at talking about how actually abusive our systems are. How, and I use that word very intentionally. I have taught in 3 states. And depending upon how you call it, we'll just say many schools, all Title I, Title III, and or Title VI, and have met some incredible teachers. And when we were colleagues, we were put in the position of competing against each other for resources, for time, for the things that would make our professional and personal lives survivable. And so I want to be very intentional in acknowledging. I know that I, at times, was not my best self. I know that I wasn't, and so I don't actually hold these people very responsible, because I know that hurt people hurt people. But the straw for me, I had tried moving schools. I had tried advocating for a full-time position. At a school that I loved, but was not supported to be at full time. And so I found my way into coaching, and I honestly hoped that coaching would remoralize my practice. And what I learned about coaching is that many administrators perceived instructional coaches as hired guns to go in and quote unquote fix quote unquote failing science departments. I never worked with a science department that was failing. I never worked with teachers that needed to be fixed. I worked with teachers who needed and deserved support. And in the course of 1 week, I had 2 interactions with 2 different principals where there was a meeting called simply to, I still don't know, intimidate me. To the point where a conversation would start gruffly. I would ask for clarification or what I was doing wrong. And I ended up weeping in both of them, and calling my coaching supervisor with like, what do I do with this? What is happening? And the instruction I got was just let it roll off your back. Don't worry about it. And I think that that kind of interaction happens at such a frequency, and it's so embarrassing and it's so scary. And, I'm embarrassed now. Colleagues would come up and say, I thought about filing a G19 on your behalf for that meeting, which is a harassment claim. But no one does, because we know how victims are treated culturally as well, right? So that week, I called my friend who was a social worker, and I said, how do I become a social worker? Thankfully, it took me a really long time. It took me 6 years because I trained as a biologist. I had never taken a psychology class. So back to community college with me. And it took me a while. And I got a gig at the University of Utah. Frankly, I was looking for anything. I would have taken a job answering phones for the ophthalmology department. But I ended up finding an incredible job supporting teachers. And so I got 5 more years teaching teachers and supporting teachers from a much more structural place. And so what that allowed me to do is blend my social work with the work I was doing with teachers. And basically my entire social work degree, anytime we got a choice in what we could study, I was looking at teacher mental health. I was understanding burnout. I was researching how are these things happening. I was watching how trauma-informed pedagogy was being misunderstood, and we were missing the trauma we were causing in classrooms. So that was the straw, but it was a pretty slow fade. It was a pretty slow exit. And I offer that because it was enough to give me hope, and to find new creative ways to practice, knowing that I had this exit strategy.
So I want you to put your clinical therapist hat on for a second, because as you're sharing your experience with us, I keep thinking about this term, emotional intelligence. And here's why I bring this up, because over the past year or so, my wife and I have been doing a lot of courses around emotional intelligence through a good friend of ours. Her name is Blue Toulousema, who does phenomenal work with emotional intelligence. I want to shout out Blue. And what Blue taught me and my wife is that the reason why we have so much internalized trauma and we harm ourselves is because we haven't had the time and the space to address the traumas that have stayed with us and lingered with us for a number of years. So now, taking that into the educational ecosystem, right? You mentioned restorative practices. We talk about social emotional learning all the time, to the point where we've liquidated these terms and taken away their power. And I just keep thinking to myself as you're talking, how are we expected to engage in social emotional learning practices and restorative practices when yet we're in a profession that doesn't allow us the space and the time to do those things for ourselves? It just seems counterproductive. It sounds very contradictory. I mean, would you agree with my assessment on what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's astute and timely and accurate. Excuse me.
Yeah, and so yeah, so I'm just wondering, just in thinking about that, how did you start to learn about yourself as you were making that
Mhm.
transition from the classroom to a clinical therapist? Because you had to have done some soul searching and you had to have done some time traveling to figure out, how did I get here? How did I get to this place? So I'm curious.
Yeah, it's the right line of questioning. Um, at the risk of being, you know, uselessly personal, I offer it in the hopes of being useful. Um, while all of this was happening, while I was working full time at the university and earning a social work degree, my personal life was absolutely disintegrating. I had been supporting my partner to start his own business, and there was a lot of stuff happening with our family, a lot informed by this intergenerational trauma. And I had to experience too closely that I was very much risking my very self. And so it's less that I learned how to take the time, and it was more that I was forced to take the time when my body stopped making cortisol, when, you know, honest to goodness, Kwame, the thing that saved me, saved my partnership, and saved anything good that came out of this learning was the pandemic, for all of its cruelty and for all of its the brutality that it laid bare. It forced me to stop. It forced me to stop and do some really deep work. I'm also an IFS practitioner, an internal family systems practitioner, and really committed to, exactly as you say, doing that work for and with myself. And all of this sounds wildly impractical for a current in the classroom educator, right? Educators, many didn't get to stop for as long as the rest of the world got to stop, right? And are still recovering from the PTSD that their nervous systems have acquired. And so what I want to be really clear about is that currently the demands that we do all of the socio-emotional learning, and that our pedagogy is trauma informed without any training about what that actually means or looks like. And we're asked to do it on top of the state sanctioned curriculum. And here we have to be ruthlessly honest again. We can't do all the things. We can do anything we want, but we can't do everything we want. We have to make some tough choices about how we're spending instructional time. That being said, I think one of the most powerful learnings from my clinical work is understanding what developmental trauma is. Developmental trauma is not that bad things happen to children. It's that bad things happen to children, or things happen that children don't understand, and they don't have a self-regulating adult with them to say, what are you feeling about this? How are you understanding this? How can we find the next step for you? And so there's much more hope for in-classroom teachers who may feel really dysregulated themselves. One of the best things about a helper nature, man, we're good at crisis, right? So even if I'm not feeling okay, if I know that I'm values aligned when I prioritize the students in my classroom while I'm with them, I can show up as present and pleasant for them, no matter what is happening. You're right. The structural demands are impossible, and we have to throw some stuff out. And so we must make some tough choices. If I have to throw out checking in with someone who's obviously not okay in a way that's okay for them, or making sure that we get through describing this homework for the evening, I'm not going to assign the homework, right? The changes can happen on a scale that fine, and they can be impactful, even though the system remains presently stacked against us. We have to start somewhere.
And this is a perfect segue into us now being solution oriented. So we've presented a lot of challenges. Now let's think about some solutions. So in order to retain more teachers in the profession, because the name of the book is Planning to Stay. And I don't want to give our audience the message that, teaching is so horrible, we got to get up out of here because of the way the system is structured and yada, yada. And all those may be true, but this is such a beautiful profession still, even with all of the ugliness and all of the problems that exist. It's still a beautiful profession that is highly necessary, not just here in the United States, but just throughout the entire world. We need education. Education is so critical. So, in saying that, I'm wondering, how do we not prevent or minimize the burnout, the demoralization, the exploitation, all these maladies? Is it a case of addressing it at the pre-service level, where we have our universities who are training teachers and teachers going through practicums, right? Are we looking at the syllabi in these programs where we're bringing in more classes focused on emotional intelligence? Or is it a case where every school should have a therapist like yourself providing some counsel to teachers? We have school counselors, not in every school, but we have school counselors for kids. Can we get some counselors for teachers too, so they can talk about their problems? So I'm wondering, what are some of the other remedies we can employ to address, tackle this issue?
Yeah. Excellent question. We already know some of the structural answers. We know we need to pay teachers more. We need smaller class sizes. Those are non-negotiables. Those are such obvious answers, and they will help. However, even if they don't happen tomorrow, we still have some options. thank you for being willing to talk to me, even though I'm not currently in the classroom. I think one of the wild things about the profession is it's kind of like we earn membership in a gang, and once we leave, we lose all street cred, right? There's a pressure to stay in. There's a pressure to take the body blows. And I want to really examine that because that's also abusive, right? I want anyone to know listening to this that you will cause more harm forcing yourself to stay in the classroom, dysregulated and disconnected. You will hurt students. It is more ethical to leave if you are in that place. And if this is your calling, if this feeds you, you can figure out a way to do it. You absolutely can. The things that we see as most demoralizing are adversarial school cultures, meaningless busy work so that we can prove our worth for federal grant making, programs on any scale, department, school, or district that promote some distal experts' experience and expertise over what teachers are seeing in their classroom live and in front of them. Teachers are experts in their contexts. When we can return the trust to teachers as professionals and support with transparency, with safe feedback loops, with true collegiality, I think I think we could shift the entire culture. I do. I also want to offer the idea that the choices might not be burn out or be a 30-year teacher. I have come to start thinking of my time in the classroom as a sort of tour of duty. And I look forward to the next one when I'm resourced enough to know that I can support myself to be the teacher that I want to be in it and to not be vulnerable to these pressures. I actually just proposed to my partner that I start back in summer school this summer, and he had some fair questions about what that could look like. But I think that we need to think of it in terms of they are all our children. And like any rich multi-generational family, the aunties, the cousins, the grandparents, we all take turns. And it's okay if you need to tap out, and it's okay to ask someone else to tap in. So I'm hoping that we can be a little more flexible in our treatment of the career versus participation of expert teachers in general.
Excellent points. Excellent points. And I agree with everything that you're saying. We have to make some changes sooner rather than later because we're just continuing to lose quality teachers just on the daily. It's impacting our students. So I have one last question before we wrap up. And it's probably the most popular question on this podcast. How do you, Jess Cleeves, stay true to the teacher in you, even as you're doing your work in clinical therapy?
Oddly, I get to be truer now to the teacher in me because I am a relationship therapist. And so I get to utilize the same skills that I learned. I get to assess, I get to build constructivist learning plans. I get to support people to achieve and to build new skills and frameworks. And I get to do it on the smallest level of community organizing there is. I get to do it with 2 people systems. And selfishly, that's deeply fulfilling, but it's not enough. And so I stay true to the teacher in me that is in community with other teachers by still continuing to participate in other spaces with the expertise that I have earned. For example, testing is used in all kinds of ways to harm all kinds of people. As a social worker, our licensing exam is horribly racist, it's poorly conceived, and it's keeping lots and lots of clinicians of color, multilingual clinicians, and clinicians with learning differences out of clinical rooms. And so this last year, participated on our local board to pass HB 250, which eliminated one of the exams, and we're working to build a quote unquote alternate path, which I'm hoping we can rename a practitioner's path, so that folks can stop pretending that exams are the end all be all way of measuring capacity. Those are the two main ways. The most direct way for teachers is I'm going to keep writing books. I've got 2 more in the pipeline because I think it's helping. And I hope to offer to your listeners, I was offering these book groups. And man, that was tough because teachers are so busy. If I offer them on Saturday, that's the time when they're hanging out with their kids' soccer games. Sunday intersects with church service or family dinner. Tuesday afternoon is when we have our PLCs. So I have a new feature on my website, jesscleeves.com, where you can actually request a book club moment with me. So if I can be supportive of any teachers out there, you just literally raise a hand, submit this form, say, can you meet with us? And we'll find a time. So I'm enjoying teaching with and for teachers to stay true to the teacher in me at this point.
Awesome. And thank you for sharing your website. I don't know how active you are on social media, but if you do have social media handles, just let the audience know how they can connect with you there as well. And also where they can purchase Planning to Stay.
Yeah, thanks. You can purchase Planning to Stay at your favorite indie local bookstore. You can find it on indiebound.org, bookshop.org. You can find it at the big guys. There's also an audiobook read by me. My Instagram handle is Learning Humans with Jess. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Learning Humans. I am not super active. It turns out that social media is not why I'm on the planet. So find me there. The best way to stay very connected to me is through my newsletter. So Jess Cleeves, JessCleeves.com. Sign up for the newsletter. That'll let you know when the next teacher relationship workshops are coming up and when the next book is out.
All right. You heard it here on the podcast. Jess, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you again for being a dedicated supporter of the podcast. I don't take the support for granted. When you're doing a podcast, you just hope that there's at least 1 or 2 people who are listening and are getting some important lessons from the episode. So to get that feedback and to hear that, you've really grown in your practice and in your just in your life through this podcast, it pretty much validates the work that we're doing here. So thank you again.
It's an honor and a privilege. Thank you for your work.
All right. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. Sending my love to your family.
Likewise. Take good care.
All right, people. Whew. Man, this was a good one. I cannot wait to watch the playback for this. Listen, y'all, as you already know, we're going to close out another episode. And as always, I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.